From the KIRO Radio Newsroom in Seattle, I'm Dave Ross, and these are the Ross Files.
This is Seattle's Morning News. Dave Ross with Colleen O'Brien and Chris Sullivan. Maybe you've wondered why Seattle seems to have a bigger homelessness problem than much poorer cities like, for example, Detroit. Well, there is a reason, and Gregg Colburn talks about this in a new book, which was co-authored with Clayton Aldern. It's called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. So are you saying that it is not linked to things like mental health or personal responsibility, criminal behavior, things like that?
I don't know that I would completely agree with your assessment there. We certainly acknowledge in the book that individual vulnerabilities, be it poverty, mental health challenges, substance use disorders, certainly have a causal relationship to homelessness, right? Those are risk factors that are well acknowledged in the scholarship, risk factors for homelessness. What we argue in the book is that every community in the country has people with vulnerabilities, be it addiction, mental health, poverty, et cetera. But the point of the book is that the consequences of those individual vulnerabilities are more severe or more acute in places with very expensive housing markets and where housing is not abundantly available.
So people in crisis are common to all cities. It's just that it's easier to cope in some cities than others?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, for example, Detroit has the highest poverty rate in the country. We know that poverty is a cause of homelessness, yet Detroit has 1/5 the homelessness that King County has.
So explain to me why that happens.
Well, I think there's a basic intuition here, and then I'll turn it over to Clay to have him respond as well. But the basic intuition here is that if you have very limited resources, it is easier to figure things out in a place where housing might only cost $600 or $700 a month than in a place where it costs $1,500 to $2,000 a month. This is not earth-shattering research in the sense that there's a really basic intuition that underlies it. And I think we would all understand if we put ourselves into that position, that through sources of public assistance, familiar or social support systems, that in a place where housing is much cheaper, you might be able to make it work. And that becomes very, very difficult when we start to look at the rents that people face on the West Coast of the United States, where many times it's $1,500, $2,000 just to afford a housing unit.
But it sounds like you're saying every city then really needs a sufficient number of poor neighborhoods, poor people who can't afford $2,500 a month for rent can afford at least something.
Well, I don't know that I would call it poor neighborhoods. I would say we need more abundant, affordable housing in every city in the nation. There's no doubt about that. And so I would say that a city without housing that's affordable to people who are making the minimum wage, for example, to me is not a healthy community, because in other words, without access to that housing, what we're saying is people who earn lower levels of income are not welcome in our community. And I don't think that is that's not a healthy or productive society, at least in my opinion.
So the question is, how does that happen in a market economy? Because I've lived here, 44 years now. I can remember when we had in the Westlake area, which is now completely developed, we had basically old flop houses. I mean, these were places that were run down, but obviously they were someone's home, because once that stuff was replaced, you saw the tents popping up. And yet nobody is going to set out to build low-cost housing if they expect to make a profit. So it sounds like we're stuck.
Well, we're stuck if we believe that the only source of housing in the United States is through private market mechanisms. I would argue that we have had a very healthy and robust housing system that includes both private market sources as well as public market sources. We've had a history of public housing in the United States. Right now, we construct hundreds of thousands of units with tax credits, and those are tax credits that come from the federal government that are distributed to local jurisdictions to help construct affordable housing. We have seen in the last couple of years local governments, be it the city or the county, get involved in procuring or acquiring new housing in the form of hotels. And so I don't necessarily buy the argument that the private market is the sole delivery mechanism for housing. I don't think that is reasonable or responsible. I firmly support private market developers. We need a lot more housing in Seattle, and so I cheer when developers want to build more housing. But I also believe there's a role for the public sector, and I don't believe that that's inconsistent with a healthy, vibrant private market. And when we start to think about rents in places like Seattle, with the land costs that we have, with the materials costs that we have, and the labor costs that we have, it is very, very difficult for a private market actor to construct housing that will be affordable to someone who can only afford $600 a year. Yeah. And so if we simply say, well, then we're out of luck, then we're going to continue to face the problems that we confront in the city right now. And to me, that is not, it's it's not wise on many levels. I think we have a moral and ethical challenge there. I think we also just have a healthy community challenge in the sense that are we saying that third grade teachers can no longer live in the city because they can't afford $2,000 rents? I don't think that is a good way to run a community. And therefore, I do believe that there needs to be a stronger role for governments at all levels in the provision of housing.
Your co-author is Clayton Aldern, who is your data guy. So, Clayton, what does the data tell you on this? By how much does housing have to be subsidized in a place like Seattle to accommodate all the people who need low-cost housing?
Hey, thanks, Dave, for having us. I don't feel comfortable speaking directly to that question because we don't think a lot about this notion of subsidy in the book. What I can tell you is that Gregg's right. We need housing up and down the income spectrum. It's not just a matter of thinking through the provision of low-income housing. And while that's necessary and essential, we need housing for everyone who's interested in living in the city. And folks have a lot of different types of incomes, right? We know that. I can say that a couple of years ago, the consulting firm McKinsey took a look at this question of extremely low-income households and those earning less than 30% of the area median income. And they said, listen, under this kind of conservative set of assumptions, we think that ending homelessness in King County is going to cost somewhere on the order of 4.5 to about $11 billion over 10 years. Okay. And so let's call it $1 billion each year for the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. That's a big number, right? But we've spent in the region, lots of money before on infrastructure projects. And the argument we make in the book is that housing ought to be considered an infrastructure investment as well.
But building it as we have on some of the most expensive land in the city, I'm thinking of some of the downtown buildings that have been refurbished essentially, is you're not going to house enough people even if you had $1 billion a year. I mean, isn't that one of the reasons we're building light rail, for example, so you can build housing on cheaper land in the suburbs and still have access to the jobs in downtown Seattle that many low-income people hold?
So two things. One is, a key part of the story here is increased density. I would agree with you if we're constructing single-family homes on very, very expensive parcels of land, that is not a wise investment for our community. But I do think much higher density housing can be reasonably constructed even in relatively high-cost areas. And so a big theme in not just our book, but in housing discussions right now is that we will need to have denser housing in our region to accommodate the growth that we continue to expect to achieve here. Transportation is also critical in this. And so light rail will absolutely allow us to spread out the population up and down the Puget Sound corridor, from Everett down to Tacoma. And that will allow people to live in other places that potentially have lower cost housing than in the urban core of Seattle. And so I would absolutely agree with you. But I also believe that I don't think we need to abandon the urban core from a housing standpoint because dense housing can be built in the urban core, and I believe it needs to.
A few years back, we were talking about micro apartments, right? These are essentially dormitories. I think in some cases they had shared bathrooms, but neighborhoods didn't want them. They were afraid. The ostensible reason was there'd be too much traffic. I think it was probably, though, it would be an influx of low-income people. Don't you have to get past that too?
I think part of what you're talking about, Dave, is that there's a perceptual challenge here. And I think when it comes to housing and homelessness, and in particular when it comes to thinking about the provision of low-income housing, you're absolutely right in that there's this intense othering that takes place, right? There's this gap in experience between people who have housing and people who don't. And part of what our project is interested in is figuring out how to close that gap, right? How do we understand the problem of homelessness as indeed a problem of housing and not a problem of personal deficiency, right? And so I don't think you're wrong. I think it's absolutely true that sometimes these discussions around densifying urban cores are tinged with this understanding of the problem that says, oh, well, if we do that, there are going to be more of these other types of people here. Yeah. And I think what Gregg and I would argue, and I'd be interested to hear from him, is that if you can indeed understand the problem as one of a market challenge, one of a market failure, if you can understand it as a housing problem, it's a little easier to see one another as human beings worthy of dignity.
And Dave, this is Greg. I would just follow up and say that there's been a lot of really interesting research on the power of local communities in decisions related to housing. Mm-hmm. And we know that single-family homeowners typically have not warmly welcomed multifamily housing, especially multifamily housing that's designed to accommodate low-income households into their neighborhoods. And that is and every time I give a talk about housing, I say that this is a fundamental challenge that we have to confront. And if ultimately a relatively small segment of the population continues to frustrate or create impediments for the construction of housing, we will all collectively pay the cost of this. Not at the same level of people without housing, but generally speaking, we have to change the way our built environment is constructed in this community over the next 30, 50 years, or we will have significant problems. And so I think that's a big part of the work that needs to be done. And a lot of people are focused on that. And I think for everyone listening, who lives in a single family home. I live in a single family home. And so I am not disparaging those who do live in single family homes, but I think there needs to be a changing perception in terms of how we think about our neighborhoods. And the fact that more people come into a neighborhood is a positive thing. It is not necessarily, it's not a bad thing. And failure to welcome people into our neighborhoods through different types of housing is blatantly exclusionary, and it has significant costs.
So this is the new redlining, huh?
Yeah, it's a form of it. Yeah, it's redlining, for those who are not familiar, was actually institutional in the sense that the mortgage system and governments were involved in that process. This would be, in essence, in kind of a softer form of that, in the sense that people can go to community meetings and say, I don't want multifamily housing in my neighborhood. The more difficult that process becomes, people then go elsewhere. And so it is a way of preserving an exclusionary way of providing housing. And this has happened all around the United States, right? This is not exclusive to Seattle.
What about looking at this from the wage perspective? If wages for these low-paid jobs were higher, and these are essential jobs. I mean, we're talking about people who maintain the buildings, and you mentioned school teachers, right? If wages were higher, then maybe the market could solve this problem. Has any city addressed it from that angle?
I'm not aware of research exactly to that end, but what I can say, Dave, is it's certainly true that housing prices and population growth, right, have both outpaced growth in wages in our region over the same time period, right? If you look at the past decade or so, housing prices have exploded, and the region has seen, quite a bit of population growth, and wages, in real terms, have stayed relatively flat. So no question, it's part of the equation. Greg, are you aware of anybody who's looked at that exact question?
No, I guess. No, the answer to that question is no. The way I would respond to your question, Dave, is that in the sense that we have housing costs that are completely out of control. And so to me, a policy of just saying, let's have wages chase out of control housing prices, to me, is not a great way to pursue this. I think a better way to pursue it is, why don't we continue to have reasonable wage growth for low and middle income households, and then housing that's affordable to them? We know that housing can be affordable. Detroit has far lower wages than Seattle does. Mm-hmm. But its housing is affordable. And so they have 1/5 the rate of homelessness that we do. So I don't know that paying Seattle public school teachers an Amazon software engineer wage is the solution to this crisis. I hope we could, but I'm a realist in understanding that it's unlikely we're going to pay our school teachers $250,000 a year. And therefore, because there are so many people making $20,000 to $60,000 to $70,000 a year in our region, I think we need to have a real hard conversation about how do we make sure that wages are real. We have a minimum wage now, which has certainly helped. But even working full time at the minimum wage gets you nowhere near where you need to be to accommodate or to afford housing. And therefore, that's why we center the conversation around housing. But the point stands that wages need to continue to grow. We have huge wage disparity in the United States, and most of the wage gains in the last couple of decades have gone to the top 5% or 1% of households. And so that's certainly part of the conversation. Yeah. But our gap is so significant right now that even 5 or 10% increases in the minimum wage would still not get people anywhere near where they need to be to afford housing.
Okay, so we have to build higher density housing in single-family neighborhoods, or we have to open up more land, a lot of which is locked away for environmental reasons, or we have to figure out vastly more efficient building methods, which would mean prefabricated buildings or, mass-produced dormitory-style apartments. Do you have any idea what that would then look like? If we look at, just take the example of Seattle over the next 10 years or so, if we really committed to solving this problem of homelessness, how would the city change?
I think the fears around density are greater than what we will actually experience if we do this. And so, I first got interested in housing when I was coaching Little League baseball in Cabrini Green, which is a notorious housing project in Chicago. And this was in the 1990s. And I think a lot of people, when they think about higher density housing and public involvement in housing, they go to these massive public housing programs like Cabrini Green in Chicago and say, that's not what I want in our city. In reality, we have a lot of public housing already in Seattle that people don't even know is public housing. And so what would it look like, Dave? I think what you'd see is, and students at the University of Washington have done some good work in studios on this, in the sense that if we think about all the station areas that are going to be built up and down the light rail corridor in our region, and I'm working with a group that's thinking about how do we create high density livable communities around those station areas. The goal is, how do we build 10,000 units around each of those station areas? Rather than, let's say, 1,000 units, let's build 10,000 units. And it sounds like a lot. But the reality is that when you visualize that, what it is it's a cool area. You've got more dense housing, slightly higher near the station area. It starts to go down a little bit. It might be, 3 flat, 4 flat type housing. And you might have 10 stories or more very near the station area. And it's walkable. It's a pleasant experience. And so I think in reality, if we do this well, and let's say we have 50, 60 station areas times 10,000 units, that's a lot of housing units. We could really put a dent in our deficit if we do this well. And I think what you'd see is visually it'd be appealing. And I think that these would be places that people would enjoy living. The specter of public housing and the projects is not the reality of what we would actually experience.
I would also just add that a lot of the exciting stuff that we've seen materialize over the past couple of years is vis-a-vis existing units, right? And that's not to suggest that we don't need to build anymore. We do, and at a huge scale. But it's something like a housing authority takes control of an old hotel, and all of a sudden those units are being used and used by people who need them. That's a great solution. And by the way, your block doesn't look any different, except perhaps there are fewer people sleeping outside. Right now, the system writ large is not working. And Dave, the picture you paint is, I think, a picture of a system that is working. And we're interested in vibrant communities, and we're interested in ensuring that folks have access to the housing resources and community resources that they need. This picture is one of, indeed, a vibrant community, a system working. I think the question, I have is, why are we okay with the status quo, which is a system that doesn't work?
Yeah, well, people want the tents gone and want their neighborhoods to stay the same. And I don't think those two goals are necessarily compatible. If you're talking about light rail stations with 10,000 additional residents. I mean, that's what light rail was meant for. Absolutely. It's got the capacity for that. But the zoning, I mean, when the governor tried to propose such a thing during this past legislative session, where you'd have that kind of zoning near the light rail stations all over the region, it got nowhere, even among Democrats. So then what?
Well, we've got a lot of work to do, Dave. You're exactly right. And this gets back to the perception around housing, in the sense that I think people have the view of Seattle of 30 years ago and say, I really like that, and I want to preserve that. The reality is Seattle is now a global city, and global cities look and operate very differently. And we will look and operate differently over the next 50 years. And it's a matter of, is it going to be a very painful transition, or will we transition more gracefully and welcome kind of this new reality of our region? I think the Seattle of 1970s is gone. And if we kind of hold on to that idea, it will continue to create challenges for us going forward. And does that frustrate some people? Sure, absolutely. And I understand that people say, I really like Seattle the way it used to be. I understand. The reality is it's not there anymore. I think what we're going to see is Seattle's going to look a lot more like big global cities. And if you travel the world and go to big global cities, what you'll see is you don't see a whole bunch of single family zoning 5 minutes from the urban core.
No,
it's
absolutely true. Absolutely true. Gregg Colburn and Clayton Aldern, the co-authors of Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Read their bios. They are genuinely impressive. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for having us, Dave.
Remember that when there's a longer version of the interviews on Seattle's Morning News, you can usually find it right here in the original form, unconstrained by the limitations of a live broadcast. And you can subscribe so that when someone says, did you hear what was on Seattle's Morning News, you can say, not only that, I heard the part that wasn't on Seattle's Morning News. So my advice is to subscribe. And then when we talk to an author, a politician, an entrepreneur, an artist, a scientist, a teacher, a journalist, a celebrity, you'll hear every word. I'm Dave Ross. Thanks for tuning in.